The gravel crunched under my tires when I pulled into the parking lot of the Legion Hall, and I sat there for a moment with the engine running, just watching the lights inside. It was the kind of October evening that gets under your jacket no matter how heavy it is. The trees along the road had already gone orange and red, and most of the leaves were down, pressed flat and wet against the pavement. I could see shadows moving behind the frosted windows of the hall. People finding their seats. My brother's wedding. My family inside. I turned off the engine and didn't move. There's a thing that happens when you've worn a uniform for long enough. You stop thinking about what other people see when they look at you. You think about what the uniform means, not to them, to you, to the people who served beside you, to the ones who didn't come home. That's the only thing it ever meant to me, from the day I put it on at 18 to the day I retired at 41 with 2 gold maple leaves on my collar and more years behind me than I knew what to do with. My sister-in-law-to-be had called me 3 weeks before the wedding. She was perfectly pleasant about it. That's the part that still gets me. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't even rude, not technically. She said she'd been talking to my mother about the guest list and the photos, and she wanted everyone to look cohesive in the pictures, and she thought it might be better if I wore something a little more. She paused there, and I could hear her choosing her word. Civilian. She said civilian like it was a compliment. I told her I'd think about it. Then I called my mother, and my mother said, and I want to be precise here because I've turned this sentence over in my mind so many times it's worn smooth. She said, "Vivienne, you know how you get. Just don't make it about yourself. Just don't make it about yourself." I've been a captain in the Royal Canadian Navy for 6 years by then. Before that, I served as a lieutenant commander for 4. I'd done 2 deployments on HMCS Halifax. I was on the water during the ice storm coordination off Newfoundland in January of 2017, when we ran supply lines to communities that couldn't be reached by road. I'd watched a man I served with get pulled out of the North Atlantic on a rescue stretcher, and I held his hand the whole way back to shore, and I didn't cry until I was alone in my bunk at 2 in the morning. But sure, don't make it about yourself. My brother Callum is 5 years younger than me. He has my mother's eyes and my dad's stubbornness, and he has spent his entire adult life being very good at doing nothing that required sacrifice. He sells real estate in Kelowna. He drives a truck that cost more than my first year's salary. He proposed to his girlfriend on a boat he rented for the day, and he posted about it on Instagram before he told any of us in person. I love him. I want to say that clearly. He's my brother, and I love him, and none of what happened that night changed that. But I also know what it cost me to do what I did, and I know that he never once thought about that cost. Not once. Not when I missed his high school graduation because I was deployed. Not when I sent money home the winter my father hurt his back and couldn't work. Not when I called from Halifax at midnight on his birthday because that was the only window I had and I wanted him to know I remembered. He never said thank you. He just said, "Yeah. Hey, thanks for calling, I gotta go." That was who we were. That was the shape of us. The week before the wedding, my mother called again. She said my brother had mentioned that maybe it would be nice if I just wore a dress, something blue to match the bridesmaid colors. She said she'd even offer to buy it. She said this like it was generosity. I sat on the edge of my bed in my apartment in Esquimalt, and I looked at the closet door. I knew exactly what was in that closet. The uniform I'd had dry cleaned and pressed and hung in the garment bag with the white zipper. The medals on the bar in the right order, the way they've always been. The white gloves folded on the shelf above. The cap with the oak leaf on the brim. I didn't answer my mother that night. I said I'd let her know. I drove from Victoria to Kelowna in one day. It's about a 6-hour drive through the mountains, and I did it alone, which I prefer. I stopped once for gas and a coffee outside of Hope, standing in the parking lot of a gas station in a light rain, with my hands wrapped around the paper cup, watching the mountains disappear into cloud. I thought about calling my friend Nadine, who'd served with me on the Halifax and would have told me exactly what to do in about 45 seconds flat. I didn't call her. Some decisions you have to make in the quiet. I got to Kelowna in the late afternoon and checked into the hotel my mother had booked for the family. The room was small and faced the parking lot and smelled faintly of whoever had stayed there before me. I hung the garment bag on the back of the door. The rehearsal dinner was that evening. My mother hugged me at the door of the restaurant like she hadn't seen me in 2 years, which was almost true. She held my face in her hands and said I looked tired. My father shook my hand. He's always shaken my hand. That's just how we are. My brother was on the other side of the room with his arm around his fiancée. He waved at me. Just a wave. The same wave he gives the pizza delivery guy. I sat through the dinner. I ate the salmon. I drank 1 glass of white wine and switched to water. The woman beside me, some cousin of the bride's I'd never met, asked me what I did, and when I told her, she said, "Oh, that's interesting." The way people say it when they don't know what else to say. She asked if I'd ever been on a big ship. I said yes. She said wild and turned back to her pasta. After dinner, when people were starting to drift toward the door, my mother pulled me aside near the coat check. She looked at me the way she's looked at me my whole life, like I am a problem she has been asked to solve and has not yet figured out. She said, "So you'll wear the dress tomorrow, right? Something nice?" I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "I'll be there, Mom." She took that as a yes. I let her. That night I took the uniform out of the garment bag and hung it properly on the hanger and set it against the wall where I could see it from the bed. I lay in the dark for a long time. I thought about a lot of things. I thought about a Sunday afternoon when I was 16, and I told my parents I wanted to join the Navy, and my father laughed. Actually laughed, not unkindly, just dismissively, the way you laugh at something that doesn't need to be taken seriously. I thought about my mother saying, "Girls like you don't need to do something like that." I thought about what she meant by "like you." I still don't entirely know. I thought about the day I made lieutenant commander and I called home from the base, and my mother said she was happy for me and then asked if I was seeing anyone. I thought about the people I've served with, about what it costs to do this, about the fact that cost is real, that it shows up in your body, in your sleep, in the way you flinch sometimes at sudden sounds in parking garages, about the fact that nobody in my family has ever once asked about that cost. I reached over and turned off the lamp. In the morning, I showered and did my hair the regulation way, and I opened the garment bag. I got dressed in the quiet of that small hotel room with the window cracked an inch because I needed air. I pinned the medals carefully. I set the cap on the shelf by the door. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. The full length of me, the uniform that I'd earned over 23 years of service to this country. Then I picked up the cap, put it under my arm, and walked out. The Legion Hall was 40 minutes outside of Kelowna, in a small town where the bride's family had roots going back 4 generations. It was the kind of place with one main street and a grain elevator and a Legion Hall that doubled as the only venue large enough for a wedding of 120 people. Old wooden floors, high ceiling with the exposed beams, a stage at one end where a local band was setting up, round tables with white tablecloths and little centerpieces of dried wildflowers. I parked and walked across the gravel lot and opened the heavy door and stepped inside. The sound was already there, the hum of 100 conversations, chairs being dragged, a child running between tables and being called back by a grandmother. It was warm inside after the October cold. Someone had lit the 2 big propane heaters at either side of the room and the windows were fogged along the bottom edges. People turned to look at me. Not everyone. Not all at once. But there is something that happens when a naval officer in full dress uniform walks into a room, and it happened then. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. I've seen it before, and I've learned not to flinch from it, just to walk steadily. Eyes forward, the way you were trained. I saw my mother first. She was standing near the front with my aunt, and when she saw me, her face went through about 4 expressions in 2 seconds. Surprise, recognition, something that I think was embarrassment. Then she pressed her lips together and looked away. I found my seat at the family table and sat down. I set my cap on the table beside my water glass. I folded my hands and waited. My father sat down across from me about 10 minutes later. He looked at the uniform. He looked at the medals. He looked at me. He didn't say anything. My brother came over before the ceremony started. He crouched down beside my chair, so he was at eye level with me, which was a gesture I wasn't expecting, and he said, Viv, come on. Just that. Come on. I said, you look great, Callum. Congratulations. He stood up and walked away. The ceremony was at 2:00. The guests took their seats and the officiant took her place at the front, and my brother stood at the altar looking nervous in the way that handsome men do, which is charming. His bride came down the aisle on her father's arm and she was genuinely beautiful and I was genuinely glad for them, whatever complicated thing existed between my family and me. I sat through the vows. I sat through the readings. I sat through the signing. What I did not know, what I had no way of knowing, was that there were 23 veterans in that room, in a Legion Hall in rural British Columbia for a wedding of 120 people. There were 23 men and women who had served, or whose fathers had served, or who came to the Legion every Thursday because they had nowhere else to go, and the people there understood them. 23 people who looked up when I walked in the door and knew exactly what they were looking at. I didn't know any of them personally. I would come to learn later that most of them were Army, a few were Air Force, 2 were Navy. Most of them were older than me by 20 years. One was a Korean War veteran who was 91 years old and had driven himself to the wedding because he still had his license and was not going to hear otherwise. The reception began at 5. There was a cocktail hour first, which I spent mostly by myself near one of the fogged windows with a sparkling water. A few people came to speak to me. One man, maybe 70, with the handshake of someone who has worked outdoors his whole life, shook my hand and said, "Thank you for your service," in the way that people mean it when they actually mean it, not just as a social formula. I said thank you. He moved on. My mother circled near me twice, but didn't stop. Dinner was served at 6:30. I was seated at the family table, which was round and seated 8. My parents, my aunt and uncle, my brother's 2 friends who were serving as groomsmen, a cousin of my mother's who lived in Prince George and whom I'd met maybe 4 times in my life. The speeches started after the main course. The best man went first. He told a story about my brother that involved a fishing trip and a misidentified fish and a game warden, and it was genuinely funny, and the room laughed, and my brother buried his face in his hands. Then my mother stood up. She'd had 2 glasses of wine. I could tell by the way she was holding her champagne flute too carefully, the way you hold something you don't want to drop. She said some lovely things about the bride. She said, Callum had always been the kind of son who brought light into a room. She said she was proud of the man he'd become. She didn't look at me once. Then she said, and this part I remember precisely because some things you don't forget, they just stay where they land. She said, some of us choose our paths because they suit us, and some of us choose paths that suit others. And I've always believed that family comes first, before ambition, before career, before anything else. She sat down. The room gave a warm little round of applause. The cousin from Prince George wiped her eyes. My father stared at his plate. I felt something settle in my chest, not anger. Something quieter than anger. Something that's been living there for a long time. I put my hands flat on the table and I looked at the centerpiece of dried flowers. And then, from across the room, a chair scraped back. It was a slow sound, deliberate. And then another, and then another, and then another. I looked up. They were standing, all 23 of them, at their different tables spread across that Legion Hall. They were standing up, and they were looking at me, and the room had gone completely silent in the way that rooms go silent only when something unexpected and unrehearsed is happening, something that nobody planned, something that is just true. The man who had shaken my hand near the window was the first to speak. He had a voice that had been weathered by years and cigarettes and cold mornings, and when he said it, it carried across that silent room like it had always been meant to be heard there. He said, "Officer on deck." And the 22 other veterans in that room said it back to him, not in unison, not rehearsed, but one after another, each one standing straight. Some of them with their hands at their sides and some with their hands over their hearts. The old Korean War veteran in the corner sitting at attention because his legs didn't let him stand anymore, but his back was straight as a plank. Officer on deck. I stood up. I don't know why I stood up. It was instinct, maybe. 23 years of it. I stood and I straightened and I looked at the room. 120 people were looking back at me. My mother had her hand over her mouth. My brother was looking at me from the head table with an expression I had never seen on his face before. He looked like a man who has just understood something that he should have understood a long time ago and is reckoning with the distance between then and now. My father, across the table, set down his knife and fork very quietly. He looked at the medals on my chest. He looked at my face. He had my mother's eyes, or she had his. I've never been sure which way around it goes. And they were full of something I didn't have a name for yet. He said, and his voice was low, and it wasn't meant for the room, it was meant for me. I didn't know. I don't know exactly what he didn't know. The medals, what they cost, what it takes to earn them, what I gave up along the way, what it felt like, all those years to call home and feel like the call was an interruption. I said, I know you didn't. I said it without anger. That surprised me. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. His hands are old now, I forget that sometimes. He is 68 years old and his hands are worn and dry, and he held mine like he meant it. I'm sorry, he said. 3 words. I've had people hand me commendations in front of full assemblies. I've had commanding officers give me citations I had to maintain a neutral expression for. I've had politicians shake my hand at ceremonies and tell me what my service means to this country. My father saying sorry across a table in a Legion Hall in rural BC, with dried wildflowers between us and the sound of 100 people holding their breath. That's the one I'll carry. The rest of the evening became something else entirely. The veterans came to speak to me one by one in the unhurried way of people who've learned to take their time. I heard stories. The man with the weathered handshake had served with the Royal 22nd Regiment in Cyprus. A woman about 10 years older than me had done 2 tours as a logistics officer with the Canadian Forces in Afghanistan, and now ran a small farm outside of Penticton. The 91-year-old in the corner had a picture in his wallet of himself at 20 and his dress uniform, and he showed it to me without preamble, just held it out, and I took it in both hands the way you take something that matters. My brother came over near the end of the night. The band was playing something low and unhurried. People were on the floor, or at the tables talking, or out on the steps getting some air. My brother sat down in the chair beside me, and we were quiet for a moment. He said, I didn't know Mom was going to say that. I said, I know. He said, the speech thing, about ambition. I said, I know, Callum. He was quiet for another moment. He had a glass of something amber in his hand that he was turning slowly. He said, I don't know what it's like, what you do. I don't think I've ever actually tried to understand it. I looked at him. He's 36 years old. He has laugh lines now. He looked younger than I've seen him in a while. I said, you could. He nodded. Not like he was agreeing to fix something right now, tonight. Like he was agreeing that the distance between us was real and crossable if we both went toward it. That might be all you get sometimes. That moment of agreeing the distance is crossable. It's more than I'd had before. My mother found me near the coat check at the end of the night. People were getting their jackets. The caterers were starting to move through the room. The old Korean War veteran was being helped to his car by 2 younger men, and he was telling them something with great authority and gesturing with his free hand. My mother stopped in front of me. She looked at my uniform. She looked at my face. She looked like someone who has spent a long time believing one version of a story and is beginning to understand there might be another. She said, You've always been the strong one. It wasn't an apology. I don't think she's ready for an apology yet. That might take longer. That's all right. I said, Mom, I just wanted you to see it. She said, I see it. Maybe she meant the uniform. Maybe she meant something larger. I don't know. I let it be whatever she needed it to be. I drove back to Victoria the next morning, through the mountains, in the kind of early light that turns everything golden before it decides what color it's actually going to be. I stopped at the same gas station in Hope, got the same coffee, stood in the same parking lot. A truck pulled in beside me. The driver was maybe 50, in work gear, looked like he was heading to a job site. He glanced at me and my car and the garment bag visible in the back seat through the window. He nodded. Just nodded. I nodded back. There's a kind of recognition that doesn't need words. You either know it when you meet it, or you've never had to look for it. My family spent 23 years not looking for it. Maybe they'll start now. Maybe they won't. That's not entirely mine to carry. What I know is this: I put on that uniform because it's the most honest thing I own, not because I wanted to make a scene at my brother's wedding, not because I wanted anyone to stand up for me. I didn't know any of those people were going to stand. I put it on because taking it off, that day, for that reason, would have been the one thing I couldn't explain to the version of myself that earned it. And sometimes the people who've never needed to earn something like that will eventually understand why it matters. Sometimes it just takes 23 strangers in a Legion Hall to show them. I've thought a lot about what it means to be seen by the wrong people for too long. Not invisible, that's the wrong word. My family knew I existed. They came to my high school graduation. They called on birthdays, most of them. But there's a difference between knowing someone is there and understanding what it cost them to show up. My family knew I was there. They didn't understand what it cost. And for a long time, I thought that was something I just had to carry. That the people who love you don't always have the capacity to see the whole of you, and that asking them to was asking for something they couldn't give. I had made peace with that. Or I thought I had. You can mistake exhaustion for peace if you're not paying attention. What I've come to understand, not from that night in the Legion Hall, but from the years that led to it and the months that followed, is that there's a quiet consequence to how we treat the people who serve something larger than themselves. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates, the way that weather accumulates, the way that silence accumulates, until the weight of it is undeniable and the room shifts. My mother spent years believing that my career was a kind of selfishness, a turning away from family. She said it that night in the plainest language she had. Some of us choose paths that suit others. She meant it as a value. She didn't understand that I had chosen a path that suited everyone, just not the people sitting at that table. The 23 veterans who stood up that evening understood that immediately. They didn't need it explained. They'd lived it themselves. That's what I mean when I say there's a consequence. Not punishment. Not karma in any tidy sense. Just the plain, unglamorous truth that the choices we make about what to honor and what to dismiss shape the kind of person we become. My mother dismissed something real for a long time, and that shaped her, and it shaped our relationship, and it shaped the distance between us. None of that happened because the universe was keeping score. It happened because choices have weight, and weight accumulates, and eventually you are standing in a room where 23 strangers understand your daughter better than you do, and that's the moment the distance becomes undeniable. Callum sitting down beside me near the end of the night, turning that glass in his hands, saying he'd never tried to understand. That was him beginning to feel the weight. Not dramatically. Not with a big speech or a tearful reconciliation. Just a man in his 30s sitting with his sister and saying, honestly, that he'd been looking the other way for a long time. That's the beginning of something. It's not the whole thing, but it's real. My father saying, I'm sorry across that table, that came from the same place. He is not a man who apologizes. He is a man who shakes hands and nods and keeps moving. The fact that he stopped and put his hand over mine and said those two words tells me that something reached him that night that I had been unable to reach on my own. I didn't plan any of it. I just wore the uniform. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I didn't strategize. I didn't want a scene. I just decided that the most honest thing I could do was show up as exactly who I am and let whatever happened next happen. The rest wasn't mine to engineer. The 23 veterans standing up, that was theirs. My father's hand over mine, that was his. The only thing that was mine was the decision to stop making myself smaller to fit a space that was always too small for what I'd built. Vivian, you know how you get. Just don't make it about yourself. The thing is, it was never about myself. It was about the 23 years I gave to something worth giving years to. It was about the people who surfed beside me. It was about showing up whole. You can call that selfish if you want. Some people will, but I think the people who call it selfish are usually the ones who've never been asked to be anything larger than what's convenient, and I think, eventually, most of them come around.